Hey guys, welcome back to my channel and welcome back to another video. So if you guys are just stumbling across this video and you're new to my channel, you might not know this, but I'm Anika and I currently live in London. But you could probably tell from my accent that I'm actually a California girl living in London, and I have now lived in London for 5 whole years. So I'm more of a Londoner than I am British, but please hold, because in just about a year's time, I will actually be able to apply for my British citizenship. So a year from when this video goes live, I'll probably be a British citizen, but for now, I classify myself as a Londoner. Even though I love my life in London and I wouldn't have changed the last 5 years for anything else, there are definitely some pros and there are definitely some cons to living in London. So in today's video, I want to go over with you my pros and my cons of living in London. So if you're considering moving to London, or maybe you want to visit, or maybe you just are kind of interested in what life in London is like, make sure you watch till the very end of this video to give my honest opinion on what I think about London. Now, I really love London, as I've already mentioned, and it's really my favorite city in the whole world to live in because I've lived in a few now. But I will be brutally honest about what it's like living in London, and I will be sure to share my true cons of living in London in this video as well. Now, if you don't know me, like I said, I have lived in London for 5 years, but I also lived in Germany prior to this, so it's been a long time of me living abroad, and I actually do have an entire video on how to move abroad, so if you're interested in that kind of content, I'll link it up in the cards for you right now to check that out. But today we are going to focus on living in London, and I have to say I am not tired of living in London. London is so exciting and amazing, but there are pros and there are cons. So let's jump into that right now. So the first pro of living in London is there is something to do all the time, and I mean all the time. There's actually a really good quote that I came across that said, if a man is tired of living in London, he's actually tired of life. And that is so true because there is so much going on in London. Both obviously things that you can pay for and completely free. But the one thing I have to say is living in London means that I have something to do every weekend, every day if I really wanted to. And as a Londoner, I'd say I actively have to plan for a lazy weekend or a weekend at home. Because honestly, as you are planning out your week and your weekend, people will ask, hey, are you free this weekend? Let's do this. Or there's some sort of, meetup happening, or there's a brunch that you and your friends want to go to, or maybe there's an exhibition at a museum that you want to check out. There is always something going on in London, so you're never going to be bored. And honestly, for me, that's really exciting and really cool, and I consider that a big pro of living in London. Now, on to a con of living in London. A con is the weather. I know people talk about this all the time, and it's really hard to not talk about it because honestly, England has the strangest weather, and I think it has to do with where England is in the world and like the winds and the clouds and whatever else about climate. I don't really know, but what I can say is that it is almost always gray and cloudy and possibly raining in London, and that's just kind of what you have to deal with. Actually, funny enough, when I am recording this video, it is gray and raining outside in London. So most days are pretty much gray and there's always cloud cover. So it's not as sunny as living in California, for example. And I would consider that a con because I really do miss California sunshine and just having warmer days and just more sun, to be honest, and more light. I'd have to say that that's kind of the downfall there. And the first major con of living in London is having to deal with the gray, wet weather. So moving on to my next pro, I'd have to say London is super multicultural, actually more multicultural than any other city I've ever visited or lived in. Now, being American, normally I think of like New York City as being the most multicultural probably place in the US, maybe also San Francisco. But London totally tops that. Honestly, when I'm walking around the streets of London, I have to say, I hear so many different languages, and I just find it so fascinating that there's so many cultures of people coming into one city that creates the Londoner. Because honestly, I don't even hear British English accents that much when I walk around in London. I hear every other type of accent. And when I think of my close group of friends, actually, most of them are expats. They are living from Australia or from different countries in Europe or from the US or Canada or wherever, but a lot of them aren't even British. And that's the beauty of London, is that you get so many different cultures in one place. And what I think is also really cool about London in comparison to cities like New York, where New York kind of becomes a melting pot of people becoming American. They really identify with being American. But I really like that some people who move to London, who are, let's say, from Nigeria or South Africa or China or wherever they are in the world, they still bring their heritage and their culture to London. And they really show that. And it's really apparent. And Londoners really embrace having such a multicultural city. And I really love that you can get authentic Chinese food or authentic Nigerian food or wherever else in the world you think about. It's all happening in London because it's so multicultural, and I think living in that is such a big pro. So the next con that I'm going to talk about is that London is expensive. This isn't new news. Actually, this is probably something that you have heard time and time again, and I'm not going to sugarcoat it. London is expensive. It is way more expensive than living in certain parts of the US for sure. And it's just something you have to embrace. London is actually probably, I think, the top 5 most expensive cities to live in the world. So when you do move here or you are considering moving here, you really need to make sure you budget and you know exactly where your salary is going to go, because a lot of it is going to be going to everyday life that is more expensive in London than other places. Like the tube, for example. If you want to take the tube, it's like £2.80 for peak time. And then also the bus, it's £1.50 every single time you want to get on it. And rent, let's not even talk about rent. Rent in London is astronomical, actually. It's crazy how much of your salary every month, like I think on average, most Londoners pay about 50% of their take-home salary on just rent. And when I'm talking about rent, I'm talking about the 4 walls. I'm not talking about electricity or water or heating or any of that. Rent itself is so expensive in London. So overall, just the cost of living and everything you're going to expense in London ends up being more expensive than the average city. So that is definitely a con, and it's unfortunate, but it is just what it is. That is London. London's expensive. So I just talked about how the tube and the bus are expensive, and don't get me wrong, they are expensive compared to other European cities that I personally lived in. But what's great, and another pro to add to the list, is that it is so easy to get around in London. And I live literally minutes away from a tube station. It's about 30-second walk from my front door to the tube station. Or there's buses as well. There's so many different modes of transport that you can use in or around the London connectivity area that you can be from, honestly, zone 6, which is the furthest zone in London, into central London within an hour. And honestly, everywhere you live within London, usually there's a bus station or a tube station or a train station within walking distance, which means that you can easily commute and easily be able to go places without having to really worry about like, oh, how long is it going to take me to get there, or when do I have to catch the next train or anything like that. It's very well connected, and the London, like Transport for London network is well connected, so you never really have to worry. And I consider that a massive pro because I can easily get anywhere in London within like probably 30 minutes. Now, the con of London is that I don't have a car. Now, as an American and especially as a Californian, I honestly had a car from when I was 16 years old. It's normal to drive around. It's actually a sense of independence that you get because you have to drive yourself around in order to go to the grocery store, in order to go meet your friends, etc. And in London, it's just not possible to have a car. Aside from the fact that it is expensive, obviously, to buy a car, it is so expensive to actually park your car and actually even pay congestion fees and all these other fees that you have to pay, and possibly parking and tickets and everything else. It's just so expensive to actually own a car in London, and it really sucks because it kind of limits you. Like, as great as it is to stay connected within London and being able to like take the tube and the train and the bus to go places, I would really love a car sometimes just to drive, just to be able to get away and do things. And I'd have to say that even though I could like possibly afford a car now in London, it costs so much money just to pay for a parking permit to park the car on the street outside of my flat that it doesn't even make sense. Like, it doesn't make sense. It actually costs more to park your car in London than to drive it. So unfortunately, no car. So I guess that's, for me personally as an American, I just don't have a car, and I see that as a con because I like having a car. So guys, if you guys are finding value from this video and you are enjoying it and you're enjoying my pros and cons, please do give this video a thumbs up so I know to create more content like this. So the next pro is that there is a lot of job possibility and opportunity in London. Honestly, the job market is always booming. And I'd have to say, even in 2020, with everything that we're experiencing with the economy, if you really want to get a new job, it is definitely possible. And that's the beauty of London. There are so many industries, so many sectors. so many businesses that are global businesses that have headquarters here in London that give you so many opportunities to find a new job. And that's really amazing, because if you don't like your current job, there are so many other options of you finding a new job. Or if you're coming to the city and you want to move here, there are so many options for you getting a job. So really, when it comes to job opportunity and just starting new jobs or looking for new jobs, as a Londoner, you are spoiled for choice, and that's a massive pro in my books. And also, as a side note, Londoners tend to get paid the most in the UK, obviously because of the cost of living in London is the most expensive. But what's really great is obviously like you get a very nice salary from working and living in London, and you obviously have so many companies that you could possibly work at as well. So massive pro there. So my next con comes back to the fact that, you know, we were just talking about how London is super connected and there's a tube and train and everything, which is great. Don't get me wrong. I absolutely love that I can just jump on a tube and be in the center of London in like 20 minutes. But the con is that the tube is super hot, and I mean unbearably hot in the summer. And it is just, it's just too much for me to deal with sometimes. Like, I remember last summer, it was so hot that I would avoid taking the tube and actually take a bus in order to stay above ground, just because it's so hot. And it's just, the reason it's hot is because London doesn't have air conditioning like many other cities in the world, like New York, for example. They have air conditioning on their subway, so it's okay in the summertime. You don't feel as hot once you're in the tube. But the problem is A, you go underground and there's a lot of heat underground trapped there. And then you get on the tube with so many other people that are also just hot from the weather outside, and then the tube has no aircon and it's just so hot. So if you are going on the tube in the summer in London, just be prepared to sweat and smell the BO of other people, because it's disgusting and it's hot, and it's definitely a con of living in London. So one of my big pros of living in London, and I still love it till this day, even though we're not traveling that much in 2020, is that London is super easy to travel to and from, meaning there are so many airports that you can pick from in London to travel to. And what the best part is you can easily go on a very cheap European flight. Like, I've gone like on a return flight to Italy with like Ryanair for like £20 or something. It's crazy. It's crazy how cheap flights can be from London. And it's crazy because London has so many airports. I actually can't even think of another like city in the world that has as many airports as London does. If you think about it, we have Heathrow, Gatwick, Luton, Stansted, City Airport. I think there's Southend as well, although I don't think that's London at all. But regardless, all the airports that I just listed, what's great is that usually you can, from the center of London, get a direct train or a bus to any of those airports and then be on a plane to possibly any city in the world. I think London flies to almost every capital in the world, which is crazy. Like, you can travel so easily, and I absolutely love that. And London makes it easy for you to travel because, like, there are those budget airlines like EasyJet or Ryanair, and you can easily just get on a flight and go somewhere for like less than £50 if you really wanted to. And it makes it so easy to travel, and the city honestly just makes it easy for you to travel, not only to other countries, but once you go from the city center to these airports, there are trains and buses, like I mentioned. You don't always have to take a taxi or an Uber, so it makes it a little bit cheaper when it comes to travel as well. So my next con is that London doesn't really have big supermarkets. Now again, this might be an American in London kind of thing, but as an American, you drive your car and you go to a supermarket, and usually that supermarket is fairly well-stocked and large, meaning like, you know, you fill your entire shopping cart or trolley full of food and you put it into the trunk of your car, and then you drive home and you fill up your fridge and your cupboard. But in London, the thing is, I live in zone 2, and most people who do live in zone 1 and 2 tend to only have local shops. And by local, I mean there's either like the quick shop on the corner, which is like, you know, like the newsstand that has like little bits of snacks and bits that you can pick up if you're really hungry in the middle of the night or you want soda or something like that. But even the grocery stores, like the closest Sainsbury's to me is a Sainsbury's local, and even the M&S Food is a smaller M&S Food. And I think the Tesco Express is also a Tesco Express. They're all just local shops. They're not the bigger shop. If I wanted to go to a bigger shop that has like the full range of food that I'm looking for when it comes to variety and options, you'd have to actually probably drive there or catch a bus, but you can never walk to a bigger store because again, they're built for local small flats and not houses. And again, maybe this is an American speaking, but I really do miss having bigger grocery stores because I was born and raised with bigger grocery stores, and I'm used to shopping with a car and then putting everything into the car. So I guess it's kind of just like me getting adjusted, but I think that's a con because it's unfortunate that we only get local shops, which means you only get the smaller selection of food when you are living in central London. Another con that I have to say that has only occurred to me because of living in London is the harsh water and the pollution. Now that's a massive con for me. Like, honestly, the pollution is so bad in London and my skin just doesn't like it. It is what it is. I guess you just have to deal with that with living in a big city, but it's just really bad. And I really hope that the government and, the mayor of London and everyone kind of takes initiatives to make the air quality better because it is pretty bad. But also the water quality in London is horrible. It is so harsh. Now, I don't know if it has anything to do with the fact that London is an ancient city and it's been around for thousands of years, and the piping and like the way water is run, like I just think that it's maybe not the best, and I can imagine that it's quite expensive to reroute or redo all of plumbing in London, but it is so harsh that my skin just doesn't like it. I've honestly gotten eczema from living in London because the water is so harsh on my skin and it dries it out, and it's just unfortunate. And I guess that's something you just learn to live with. Like in London, the water is harsh and the air pollution is horrible. And that's just kind of the worst of the worst because it's bad for your skin all around. So yeah, definitely a con of living in London is the air pollution and the harsh water. And finally, for my very last pro of living in London is the NHS. I know a lot of people give a hard time to the NHS, and I myself included also give a hard time to the NHS, but thinking back to it, in America, whenever you want to visit a GP or you need to go in for a regular checkup or whatever the case is, the first thing they ask you is, do you have insurance? And even when you have insurance, it's like, oh, you still need to pay $20 to see a doctor. And the one thing I do love about the NHS is obviously it's inclusive in the taxes that you do pay here in London. And what's great is that, to be fair, like if I want to see a GP, I can see a GP relatively quickly within usually a week, maybe 2, depending on how backed up they are. And it's completely free. And a lot of the medication that you have to take and all these kind of things that you need from the healthcare system is heavily subsidized because you are paying into a socialist system of healthcare. And honestly, every single time I've had any sort of issue, whether it's illness or I'm not, or something's wrong with me or whatever, I have to see a doctor, I'm usually seen pretty quickly. And again, I've had all my issues treated and I've never had to really pay that much for my treatment. So I have to say that having that sort of NHS has really helped. And thinking back on 2020, the NHS has obviously massively helped with everything that's going on in the world. So I think it's a massive pro to have the NHS when you are living in London and some sort of free or subsidized healthcare. So guys, that brings me to the end of my video. I hope you guys enjoyed that. I hope it gave you guys a real life image of what it's like to be an American living in London. I gave my pros and what I love about living in London, but I also gave some realistic cons and what you can expect if you want to move into London. All I have to say is it's not perfect, and London definitely has its downside, but for the most part, London has more positives for me, and I really enjoy living in London, and I couldn't imagine living anywhere else. So if you are considering moving to London, I'd say the pros definitely outweigh the cons. If there are any other pros and cons of living in London that you want to share with me, please do leave it in the comments down below, or if I missed anything, let me know. I'm really curious to know from other people what they think are the pros and cons of living in London. So if you've made it this far into the video, you must be a loyal viewer, and I really appreciate your time. And if you like content like this about an American living in London or an American's experience of London, please do consider subscribing to my channel, because I do share my life in London here on my channel. And I also upload 2 times a week at 5 p.m. on Sundays and Wednesdays. So make sure you subscribe and turn on that bell notification so you know when my next video is going live. Anyways, guys, I hope you guys are having an amazing day wherever you are in the world, and I hope to catch you guys in my next video. Bye for now.